Let us start with the question, and the first goes to the UN Correspondent Association President, please, Miriam Rahmati.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association, thank you, Mr. Minister, for this press conference. My question is, you said that Russia will not forget and will not forgive the US of denying Russian journalists visas to come to the UN and follow your visit. What does it mean, and can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, it seems to me that today there was a statement delivered by our representative. And today there was a statement from our representative at the Committee on Information. And, of course,
you suspect that I would not speak Russian, right?
Maria has already, at the Committee on Information, spoke at length in detail about this issue. We believe that it is appalling what is transpiring here. All of the conjurations about access to information, freedom of the press, all those incantations that were voiced by Western leaders, including, of course, the United States of America, all of these were enshrined, of course, in the resolutions of the Human Rights Council, the decisions on the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which were adopted in the early 1990s. And at the time, the Soviet Union openly signed on to those agreements. And now it has become inconvenient for the West to have alternative viewpoints present. It is inconvenient for them residents of the planet and citizens of certain countries have access to facts that is inconvenient, facts which are not necessarily in line with the Western so-called narrative. Of course, the West fundamentally decided to trample upon media outlets which are not subordinate to the West. Our envoys, ambassadors in various countries, including in Washington, frequently provide specific data and information about discrimination against Russian media outlets. Many years ago, in France, there was a denial of accreditation for the Russian RT and Sputnik channels. They called these media outlets tools of propaganda. Mr. Kirby, with respect to our journalists who were denied visas to participate in this part of our presidency, Mr. Kirby also said that Russian journalists are propagandists and nothing more than that. Without anything, they have nothing to do, he said, with American so-called democratic views of freedom of speech. Of course, there's the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, apparently means nothing in practice. And perhaps it would be useful to consider how things are with freedom of speech in the United States. I've heard that Tucker Carlson has left Fox News. It's a curious news. What is this related to? One can only guess, but clearly the wealth of views in the American information space has suffered as a result. So, turning to our reciprocal measures, we will certainly take this inappropriate conduct by the U.S. leadership into account. The inappropriate conduct of the State Department, they took the decision there, and we will take this into account when the Americans need something from us.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. I would like to ask you your views on Sudan and what's happening there, and also about the involvement of the Wagner Group with the Rapid Support Forces. We asked Hamiti, the leader of this group, about the involvement of Wagner with him and his forces, and he did not deny it. And just a last question, to whom are they accountable, this group? Is it to the Russian government, to another body? Who are they accountable to? Thank you.
Well, with respect to Wagner, this is a private military company. We repeatedly touched upon this issue, including in this room a few years ago. Our French colleagues heads of diplomacy and the European Union through Joseph Borrell issued grievances towards us vis-a-vis our links to Mali, Central African Republic, and they created some kind of a mini scandal with respect to the fact that the government of Mali, under circumstances when the French began to withdraw their operations from the country and began to close their military bases in the south where the main terrorist threats remained, and the government of Mali, in order not to be left without defenses, they turned to the services of a private military company called Wagner. That is their right. This is something which the Malian foreign minister announced during a General Assembly meeting, and nobody has made this any secret. Both the Central African Republic and Mali, as well as Sudan, and a number of other countries whose governments, whose legitimate authorities turn for such services, they have the right to do so. And let's not forget, if you are concerned about this issue, take a look at the internet. Take a look at the number of private military companies which exist in the United States. They exist in Britain and in France. There are dozens of them, and many of them have for many years worked directly on our borders, including inside Ukraine. And this also gives rise to significant questions. Now, with respect to what's happening in Sudan, I think that certainly this is a tragedy. People are dying. There are threats to diplomats, and they are significant threats. We are aware of this. We are following the situation. Today, representatives of UNICEF have requested our embassy to somehow host and accommodate their staff because of the fact that they are not in a safe location. I'm not certain how this can be done, but we will tackle the situation. Let us recall the developments with Sudanese statehood, first in the singular, and then Sudan and South Sudan. And this was all transpiring before our very eyes when our U.S. colleagues made one of their foreign policy priorities the division of Sudan into two parts. They turned to us for the then President Omar al-Bashir, for us to persuade Mr. Bashir to reach an agreement for the conduct of free elections on voluntary separation and division, and we, frankly speaking, thought that the Sudanese people, the peoples, should make that decision. And ultimately the division took place. It was separated into two parts. A South Sudan was created, and the Americans, as the initiators of this divorce, so to speak, should have done everything possible to help these new two states coexist, to develop their economies, to provide for the welfare of their citizens. But the Americans didn't like something. I won't delve into the details, but they imposed sanctions both against the leadership of Sudan and against the leadership of South Sudan. And subsequently, there were constant demands being put forward through the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and so on. So this is a form of geopolitical engineering, and it doesn't bring about any positive results. I would propose that the main conclusion be drawn from this crisis. Let's not interfere in Africans' negotiations amongst themselves. Let's not seek to resolve our own African issues, and let's not add any demands from abroad which fail to reflect the interests of those countries. African solutions to African problems.
Thank you, Minister Lavrov. Michelle Nichols from Reuters, thank you so much for the briefing. I just wanted to ask you a little bit further about the Ukraine grain deal and whether Russia has a response yet to the letter that the Secretary General has sent to President Putin suggesting a way forward for the extension and expansion of this Ukraine grain deal. And China is the biggest recipient of the Ukraine grain under that deal. So has China asked Russia to extend the deal?
Well, on China, I will say right away that we haven't been discussing this issue with our partners from the People's Republic of China, including probably for purely pragmatical considerations, given that with the People's Republic of China, we have a shared border across which there's export and import going on, and the Black Sea space is not at all necessary for China to procure our grain. and grain in general from other countries that are adjacent to the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, for example. As for the letter that the Secretary General conveyed to President Putin, I hope that it didn't leak, because this is personal correspondence between the leadership of the United Nations and the leader of the UN and leader of UN member states. If this paper was, if this correspondence was disclosed, that would not be very appropriate. This would be reflective of another attempt to exert pressure on a situation, and this is not acceptable. And that a situation that has not been resolved, and this is brought to a dead end by Western colleagues. I would recall 22 July of last year, this Black Sea Initiative was agreed upon, it was signed, and the text explicitly stated that this pertains to the export of grain and ammonia. And nobody recalled ammonia before the day before yesterday. Even though yesterday Antonio Guterres told me that on the global markets there are acute shortages of fertilizer, specifically from the ammonia group. Nobody thought about this up until very recently, the last moment. And the way that this deal quickly transformed from the Black Sea Initiative to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. From a humanitarian initiative, it transformed into a commercial initiative. This is also something that gives rise to a significant number of questions, which all of us have consistently been talking about for all of this time, and we continue to draw attention to this situation. If you looked at the statistics, less than 3% of the entire volume of grain that traveled from Ukrainian ports, less than 3% truly reached the poor countries that are on the relevant list of the World Food Program. They're Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Sudan, incidentally, and Somalia. Everything else, the 80+%, will reach high-income countries or middle-income countries. We discuss this, we draw attention to this, and then there was a blatant attempt by Ukrainian colleagues as part of their activities with a joint coordination center in Istanbul. They tried to create an artificial accumulation of ships, and in Ukrainian press there were reports about the Ukrainian regime taking bribes to agree on the queue where a certain ship would be located, whether it would be placed before others without those mechanisms, bribe-taking mechanisms. We also drew attention to the fact that concentrating completely and fully on the Ukrainian part of the deal, our colleagues at the United Nations, first and foremost, forget that initially Antonio Guterres proposed a package that is inextricably linked. And he told me yesterday that the UN-Russia memorandum is not very concrete. And we signed on to this because the memorandum contains an obligation for the Secretary General and his staff to do everything possible to lift obstacles to the export of Russian fertilizer and Russian grain. I can't say that the UN has not been undertaking efforts in the right direction. On the contrary, UNCTAD Secretary General and Antonio Guterres and the Deputy Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs they have all been advocating this. They have sought to try to reach agreement with the countries that have announced illegitimate unilateral sanctions against the Russian Federation, but there has been practically no result. The Rosselschoz Bank, which is the main bank that services our agricultural exports, it has been expelled from the SWIFT system, and there are no plans to bring them back in. And in exchange, the proposal for us are one-off alternatives to 3 American banks. The Secretary General had a request to replace SWIFT and to help Rosselschoz Bank service export operations. For a few months elapsed, and indeed one of the banks kindly consented to finance one operation. But when we are told let's, on that principle, continue our efforts, that's not serious. Either you want to systemically resolve the issue of food shortages on the global market, and then there's a need to simply bring our bank back into the fold of the SWIFT system. And if you want every time for us and the UN Secretary General to run back and forth and to plead with any given U.S. financial structure for them to be so magnanimous, then you understand that cannot work and it will not work. There are still problems with insurance. And yesterday I was told by the Secretary General that the rates dropped significantly after his contacts with London Lloyd. But this is all focused on maintaining and preserving control over everything that's happening, not to prevent our fertilizer, our grain from freely reaching markets, and on the basis of market mechanisms to prevent them from entering certain countries. And this, of course, complicates the work of the World Food Program, which has been helping the poorest countries. In addition to what we have been talking about, we have nearly 200,000 tons of fertilizer, and they were seized in the ports of the European Union. Last August, President Putin publicly stated our position, according to which those owner companies of the fertilizer provide them on a voluntary basis, free of charge, to the poorest countries through the World Food Program mechanism. This was back in August. The first consignment of 20,000 tons from the 200,000 entered Malawi only 6 months later. Now it is with great difficulty that there are discussions of another 9 consignments, 24,000 tons each, for Kenya and Nigeria. And this all takes time. This is all fraught with bureaucratic red tape, with additional costs. And with respect to our part, I now return to that question. Our part of the deal, yes, we see that the Secretary General and his colleagues have been making efforts, but there have been practically no results, unless we are to view as results the hope, the glimmer of hope, that instead of normal provisions of the necessary products to global markets, there will be a need to each time manually take the effort and plead with American and European ports, banks, and other structures, insurance companies, to request that they be magnanimous. That's not the deal we reached on 22 July last year when we supported the Secretary General's initiative, which, as he has reiterated, is package based in nature. A package has many components. So, unlike you, I cannot be so confident in describing what is contained in the correspondence from Guterres to Putin, because this correspondence is, of course, not for the wider audience, but it is intended for our president. And the same letters were sent to Ukraine and Turkey, as far as I understand. But the reaction to this correspondence will arise after the recipient reads it.
It doesn't sound like you see a lot of hope for an extension of the Black Sea grain deal.
Вы психолог.
You must be a psychologist.
So Russia.
Sergey Viktorovich,
Sergey Viktorovich, today Joe Biden announced that he will run for a second term as the President of the United States. And we have already heard comments from Republicans who have also announced that they will have Donald Trump running for a second term, and they say that they are seriously concerned that this could even lead to a third world war. What is your view, what is our view of who would be more preferable as the next president of the United States, or is it all the same to us? Valentin, unlike journalists who, in their line of duty, must publicly analyze events that are taking place, the Russian government does not interfere in the affairs of other states.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Foreign Minister, for the briefing. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You talked about yesterday and a year ago about the inadmissibility of the expansion of NATO. And yet, because of the war, Finland has become a member, Sweden's next, and the NATO Secretary General is supporting Ukraine's membership. Was it a miscalculation, and where do you see the reasons now for the war, since the NATO border with Russia has now doubled? Thank you.
НАТО не собиралось останавливать.
NATO never had any intention of stopping, and if you take a look at how events unfolded in recent years, you'll see that there was a very active process of merging when it came to the military affairs of the EU and NATO, and they recently signed a declaration pursuant to which the EU is essentially delegating responsibility for the security of all of its member states to NATO and guaranteeing that EU country territories would be provided for the needs of NATO, even though they're not members of NATO. And Sweden and Finland were in the front lines of this. They were increasingly taking part in NATO military exercises and other actions that were meant to synchronize the military programs of NATO members and neutral states. So here, well, it's just a nice figure of speech that Russia sought to prevent NATO's expansion. It's not that we wanted to do this. We believed that it was necessary to prevent this, but we were also promised this on several occasions. Nonetheless, those were lies, as we all know now, just as they lied subsequently about the Minsk agreements and many other things, and then, without so much as blushing, admitted to that those were lies. The claim that Russia tried to prevent NATO's expansion and only sped it up as a result is probably how you see things or how you try to describe things from your end of the situation. We also have our own takes and our own views, and the unbiased assessments that our political scientists, as well as those abroad, make are that is that NATO sought to break Russia apart, but in the end it only made it stronger and brought it closer together. So let's not make any hasty conclusions now as to what this will all end in. We have clearly stated our goals, and we very clearly reaffirm them, including in our Security Council statement yesterday, as to what the U.S. is seeking to achieve. Well, I read materials in the local press here, articles by analysts. I talked to some of my old friends, political scientist friends, and they are increasingly asking themselves as well what's going to happen next. When it comes to our goals, we laid them out very openly and honestly as to the goals of the U.S., NATO, the EU, whether it's pumping Ukraine full of weapons, or now we hear this ridiculous theory about making sure that Ukraine can successfully counterattack now and then ask Ukraine and Zelensky to begin negotiations. This is the logic of a schizophrenic. We want there to be no threats emanating to our security from Ukraine, from the territory of Ukraine, but these threats have been piling up there for years and years, especially after the coup of February 2014. We also want for the people who consider themselves a part of the Russian language, part of the Russian culture, religion that they have been practicing their whole lives through the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We want these people to not have to face discrimination, persecution, and the threat of extermination. Zelensky has some advisor by the name of Podolak, who has stated that we'll take back Crimea and eliminate everything Russian in Crimea. Is this what the U.S. supports when American political figures and other figures say that we cannot fail to support Ukraine because Ukraine is fighting for our values and our democracy? Is this what democracy is? Are these the values for which NATO is prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian? For many years, we have drawn everyone's attention to what has been going on with minorities in Ukraine, and the Russian minority in particular. Laws were adopted prohibiting education in any language other than Ukrainian, although they did make an exception for EU languages, which once again shows just how much this whole campaign is targeted against Russian culture. There was a ban on media, both those broadcasting in Ukraine from Russia, as well as those that belonged to Ukrainians but broadcast in the Russian language and held opposition views. Millions of books in Russian have been thrown out of libraries. Some of those were burnt in town squares, just as the Nazis did back in their day. And practically all cultural contacts between our countries have been banned as well. Russian culture and what is happening, take a look also at what is happening with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We have addressed the UN Secretary General, OSCE leadership, and other institutions, and we did not get a very strong reaction. And this is similar to what happened when the coup took place in 2014, when we began to ask questions to the French, the Germans, the Poles. We asked, how is it that you promised, you guaranteed just 24 hours before the coup that you would find a settlement? You signed a document to this extent, and they just said, well, sometimes democratic processes can take on excessive forms and go too far, and that's it. And the same approach was used to justify and excuse any actions on the part of the Kiev regime, even as the U.S. confidently continued to say that they would continue supplying Ukraine with weapons to defeat Russia because Ukraine is upholding the ideals of democracy and Western values. If this is what you're fighting for, and of course I don't mean you personally and specifically, but if this is what the West is fighting for, then it should be all the more clear what we stand for and what we will oppose to the very end.
Hello. Thank you. Matthew Chance from CNN, Mr. Lavrov. Could you give us some details about what contact you may have had with US officials about the fate of US citizens being held in Russian jails? Have any contacts been had? Have they been sought? And also, secondly, there have been prisoner swaps in the past.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, sorry. There have been prisoner swaps in the past. What are you looking for in exchange for Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich?
On the agreement between President Biden and President Putin, this was an agreement arrived at when they met in June of 2021 in Geneva. A special channel was created for discussions of issues related to detained citizens of the Russian Federation and the United States and detained American citizens of the Russian Federation. I won't disclose any secret if I am to tell you that this channel did not provide for involvement of journalists, and it also did not provide for public disclosure of any situations for the purposes of exerting pressure on serious, meaningful professional negotiations which are underway. In the Russian Federation, there are several American citizens who are serving sentences for various crimes, including the individuals you have mentioned. I refer to Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich. They were detained when they were committing a crime, receiving material that is state secret. And the vociferous, pathos-laced statements about journalists by definition not being able to commit crimes are something which we reject. There are many examples of this. And somebody has already drawn attention to the situation when around Gershkovich there was a campaign that was unfolding. Nobody mentions Julian Assange anymore. Nobody mentions our citizen, a journalist, Maria Butina. She spent 2 years in a prison here simply for engaging in journalism and participating in the work of non-government organizations. We have approximately 60 people here who are serving sentences here. And in most cases, the accusations are dubious. And on a number of occasions, in the abduction of our people from Europe, from other countries, which the Americans do, on a number of occasions, they didn't deign to comply with the requirements of the Bilateral Consular Convention, under which, if they have any suspicions about Russian citizens, then they need to be not abducted, like it's done in Hollywood films, but they need to turn to the Russian Federation and they need to lay out their concerns. So once again, I would like to state that the channel for the discussion of these matters exists, and this is work that is not public in nature. And publicity here will only complicate the process for reasons which are understandable, and there's no need to tell you professionals about why.
Oh, thank you, Minister. Here, this is Betül Yürük with the Turkish news agency Anadolu. Recently, the Turkish president invited President Putin to Turkey for the inauguration of Turkey's first nuclear power reactor, which was built by a Russian energy company. Does President Putin plan to visit Turkey on the 27th of April? Thanks.
Well, this will be announced as soon as possible. I believe that presidents have an understanding about the importance of such a meeting.
Just quickly back to the Ukraine agreement. I'm Caleb Maupin from RT. I'm asking, Russia has repeatedly pointed out that Ukraine is not fulfilling its obligations under the grain deal. And my question is, does Russia intend to withdraw from the deal, or is there a reason for staying if they're not going to fulfill their obligations?
It's not that Ukraine is not complying with their obligations. Ukraine has nothing to do with the part of the deal that pertains to Russian fertilizer and Russian grain. These parts of the deal are blocked by Western sanctions, and specifically to overcome these sanctions and to lift the obstacles on the path to the export of grain and fertilizers to the market. This is what the Secretary General is working towards. He signed on in the memorandum to do everything possible to achieve those goals. And it seems that the impossible is being, we have not yet seen that. And with respect to the prospects of the deal, I think our colleagues have mentioned this. Antonio Guterres yesterday conveyed a piece of correspondence to President Putin, and this will be reported on, and the response will be reported.
The Czech president recently made statements to the effect of Beijing doesn't want peace in Ukraine, that they benefit from the status quo. What is Moscow's position on this?
I can't comment on this kind of a statement, which has nothing to do with the work of a normal political representative. I do apologize. Joseph Borrell, this was mentioned. You mentioned Czechia. I remember the European Union, which for now exists, and Joseph Borrell announced that they would develop relations with other countries on the basis of how those other countries relate to the Russian Federation and China. This shows, and this is a reflection of the current mindset and mentality of European diplomats.
With RTE Ireland, there are nearly 80,000 Ukrainian refugees currently in Ireland. Do you apologise to them for having to leave their homes, fleeing your war? And secondly, is China your friend? And if it is your friend, why aren't they sending you weapons?
Why
aren't they sending you weapons? China.
Are or aren't?
Aren't.
You know, this is laughter through tears, because nobody takes any pleasure from how the events transpiring affect the lives of normal people. But the fact that the lives of ordinary people needs to draw attention, need to be considered not just when they're outside of borders and when they present an inconvenience to host countries, but the lives of ordinary people should be considered by politicians when these lives, For many long years, on a day-to-day basis, through legislation and in practice, are discriminated against, when they are intimidated and threatened. Nobody could care less when we were drawing attention to the fact that these laws cannot be adopted. The Ukrainian constitution enshrines all rights for national minorities, political rights, religious rights, linguistic rights, and the list goes on. And when they adopted a law prohibiting and banning those rights, prohibiting the Russian Federation, Russian language and banning those rights, at that point we were members of the Council of Europe. We turned to the Venice Commission. There is this body which deals with analysis of legislation of member states of the European Council to show that it aligns with the European Convention. Council of Europe, through this Venice Commission, issued a verdict that Ukraine needs to adopt a new separate law on national minorities. They adopted this last December. And this law states that there are guarantees for all rights of national minorities in that, insofar as stipulated under existing legislation. So insofar as they were dwindled down to virtually zero. So this is completely arbitrary justice. Now, turning to refugees in Ireland, I am unaware. There's a great deal of information, including Western European, Eastern European information media outlets, that far from all of them really need it, and that they're not necessarily in such need. There are some reports about somebody stealing something, or a wife leaving a husband, and so on. I don't want to insult anybody, but on our territory, refugees began to appear a lot earlier. First and foremost, this is a consequence of the war that the Kiev regime unleashed against their own people in the east of the country. They unleashed the war only because of the fact that the people of Crimea and the east of Ukraine refused to recognize the coup. And they told these guys, leave us alone. We want to determine our affairs in our own way. And for this, they were labeled terrorists, and a war was unleashed against them. Millions of people then fled to the Russian Federation. I can't recall anybody here in this hall or in other press conferences with the participation of Western journalists being interested in this aspect of the situation. And over the past year, year and a half, we've also been receiving refugees from those regions which remain under the Kiev regime's control. And you are from Ireland. It's very good, because from time to time, I use this argument. If in Ireland the English language were to be banned, how would the British view that? It is inconceivable, completely inconceivable. But in Ukraine, the Russian language can be banned. They can publicly say, go back to Russia if you align yourself with the Russian culture. This is what Zelensky said long before our special military operation. I believe it was CNN, during an interview on CNN, he was asked what he thinks of people who live on that side of the line of contact. And he responded, well, there are people, there are species. And this leader of democracy, world democracy, continued. If somebody in Ukraine feels themselves to be a part of Russian culture, my advice for the sake of the future of your children and your grandchildren, go off to Russia. That is written in the text. And about the neo-Nazi Azov regiment back in 2013, in Washington, even in Congress, there was it was specifically designated as a structure that should not receive American financing. And he was asked about that, the Azov battalion, who are marching with Nazi flags, bearing aloft with SS division insignia. He said, well, we have many of these. They are as they are, full stop. So those values which Zelensky has been upholding in the Western world in the war against Russia, these values also include such things I think I had hoped we had long rid ourselves of, but in a minute, Europe once again embraced those traditions that had been prevalent in the past.
Minister Lavrov. Stefano Vaccaro, La Voce di New York. the UN has many goals, like increase its goals all the time. But the main goal in 1945 was to prevent World War III. And for 70 or 75 years, we have been able to, has been able to reach this goal. I heard your speech yesterday at the Security Council, and looks like you are not confident. I don't think you're confident anymore that this institution can prevent another world war. So my question is, why you are not confident, and what the Secretary General, does it have any role? Because, for example, Lula, the president of Brazil, that you just visited Brazil,
It's a
came
question,
up.
it's still a question, or
The
you want me to
question
answer?
is, the question is, why the Secretary General didn't? We're not seeing him doing the same thing the others do, and coming up with a plan.
The Secretary General.
The Secretary General of UN is not coming with a plan for peace because you are not going to even look at it, or he's not doing it because he can't do it.
А вы не хотите у него спросить?
Well, why don't you ask him? I don't know. I can only tell you.
But that's the
Могу уже?
question.
Can I answering? Okay. Насчет того, кто
Regarding who it is that's calling on World War III, President Biden, I won't be able to quote him precisely, but he has said that if we help Ukraine win, then we will prevent World War III. If you analyze the statement of your own president, well, do you, or do you only listen to my statements in the council? Some time ago, then UK Prime Minister Liz Truss said that she would not hesitate to push the red button. France, I think it was Jean-Yves Le Drian who was the foreign minister at the time, and when he heard all of these statements, he said that France also has nuclear weapons. And then the head of the aviation forces of Germany said that we're prepared for nuclear war. We're not afraid of President Putin's threats. And this was all at a time when we had not said a word about World War III. I will recall that it was us back during President Trump who proposed that the U.S. at the highest level and officially reaffirm the Gorbachev-Reagan statement about Russia and the U.S., or the USSR and the U.S. as it was at the time, are confident that a nuclear war cannot be won and it must never be waged. And we proposed this, doing the same once again under Donald Trump. We did not succeed. The U.S. side, well, if they were prepared to discuss it at all, they had a number of caveats, which of course made it lose all meaning. Under President Biden, our two presidents, Biden and Putin, made such a statement, and then it was us, once again, who took the initiative to have a similar statement about the unacceptability of nuclear war to be adopted at the highest level by all 5 nuclear weapon states. So when this topic is raised, everyone immediately begins pointing their fingers at Russia, claiming that Russia is bringing the world to the brink of World War III. Well, you know, we like to say that everybody talks about what's bothering them the most, and so all of these statements about, well, if Ukraine loses, World War III is unavoidable. I hope that the people making these claims are in their sound mind in the end, that they show responsibility.
Игорь Неймушин, РИА Новости. Сергей Викторович.
Igor Bushin, RIA News. 2 questions, if you allow. The first has to do with the Israeli delegation and the Jordan PR step made today. Were there communications with Israel before the meeting that could indicate that such a decision would be made by the Israeli delegation to leave the meeting? And the second question has to do with the most recent statement by the deputy head of the defense of the UK, who said that hundreds and thousands of missiles, including impoverished ones with impoverished uranium, have already been sent to Ukraine. What is your response to such a statement? Regarding today's meeting, I cannot, unfortunately, comment on the details because when we became the president of the council and discussed the schedule of meetings and the topics of meeting, there were no objections to having the meeting on the Middle East, including Palestine, today. Today, the representative of Israel asked rhetorical questions very emotionally about how Russia would feel if there was an anti-Russia meeting held on May 9th, which was Victory Day. Well, I've been working at the UN. I worked at the UN for 10 years, and we held meetings on May 9th discussing all sorts of issues. We also held meetings on other holidays that were important to other member states. That's just the nature of the organization. If we exclude every single date that every member state would like to leave free on a calendar, well, you understand we'll have very few days left to work with. But the representative of Israel said that they could not take part in an anti-Israel event on such a day. And, well, I think the answer lies in the fact that this was not an anti-Israel meeting. It was a meeting held pursuant to an agenda item that has been on the Security Council's agenda for decades, and the Palestinian question is one of the most protracted conflicts that has not been solved, cannot be solved by anyone or anything, and now the agreements and Security Council resolutions are being avoided, and Palestinians are being promised certain economic benefits in exchange for giving up their claims for an independent state. So this isn't an anti-Israel event. As I stressed in my statement, the meeting seeks to ensure the implementation of the initial decisions made by the UN that were meant to ensure the Palestinians' right to create their own state, and at the same time the right of Israel to security within its borders and a lack of threats to its security overall in the region. This is what the meeting was about, not condemning Israel. We also heard lots of criticism today regarding those terrorist acts that are carried out against Israelis. Everyone is well aware of this. So that is how I would answer your first question, and if you could remind me of the second. Yes, when it comes to depleted uranium, we've already addressed this item repeatedly. Whoever may claim that depleted uranium is not radioactive and that it's not included in relative IAEA lists, well, there are lists and then there are facts, and there are interviews with people who suffered, for example, in the former Yugoslavia from depleted uranium. You can find these interviews online, on our television stations, on Western stations as well in Italy. Veterans of the combat that took place there fighting the Milosevic regime, as was said at the time. So one needs to be aware of one's share of responsibility in this. And, well, the UK is on an island, so maybe for them it's less important where this depleted uranium ends up radiating or not radiating, whatever it may contain.
No, the lady then. Lady.
Thank you, Maria. Amanda with CNBC. After February 24th, by many tallies, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. Do you think Western sanctions are working, and can your country withstand more economic pressures?
We've already adapted. We adapted rather quickly. I remember back in 2010, I think Barack Obama said that Russia's economy was already in shreds. Well, if the desire is there and it seems to persist, and it doesn't change regardless of whatever administration is in power. We've long ago drawn the conclusion that we need to rely on our own efforts and on those that we can reach agreements with. When it comes to those who lie, who constantly deceive others, and attempt to achieve a unilateral advantage by legitimate means, we will no longer rely on them. Some Western companies that have been kicked out of Russia by their government, who complied with those government decisions, are now trying to come back. And our government has commented on this situation. We're not sure that we necessarily to address this right away. Let the niche that has been freed up be taken up by our own businesses. We can develop our own economy, harnessing our own resources, material resources given to us by history and by God, not through certain virtual services or artificial domination of the dollar and dependency on the dollar. And by the way, the fact that the U.S. has launched the de-dollarization process and that this process is now with great alarm being analyzed, including by local political scientists and economists, local U.S. political scientists and economists. This is a fact. If I recall, the share of the dollar in world transactions fell from 55 to 47%. So it's some 8% over the course of a year. That's quite a significant drop. And the transition to national currencies and bypassing the yen, the dollar, the euro, and the transition to digital currencies is now irreversible. What happens with the international monetary system going forward, including the IMF and the World Bank? That's a very big question. The process has been launched. The U.S. has proven that they were not telling the truth when for many decades after Nixon's abolishment of the gold standards, they said, well, don't worry, even without being backed by gold. This isn't our dollar. This is our shared common global currency that will ensure the smooth functioning of all the mechanisms of the global economy. And now that they have proven that they easily at the drop of a hat can reject the very tenets that they have been advancing as the foundation of the global economy, including fair competition and the sanctity of private property, a rejection of unilateral protectionist measures, and so on and so forth. These are all things that the globalization model was based on, that the world essentially took up and begun basing their own plans and carrying out their plans on the basis of globalization, whereas now globalization no longer has any prospects in the form in which it was conceived. We're seeing a fragmentation, a regionalization, and these are processes that we are feeling and are actively participating in as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, agreements between the Eurasian Economic Union and China, and within BRICS, where President Lula, who has been mentioned today, he's interested in preparing for the upcoming summit that will be held in the summer, preparing a concept, policy notes about how to gain independence from the whims of those who have been governing the international financial system so far.
Minister, Dezhi Xu with China Central Television. First, a quick follow-up on the grain deal. You just talk a lot about the nature, whether it's commercial or humanitarian. Do you think that Russian has been fooled in the beginning to sign this deal? And my question is, you talk a lot about a new world order, which has been resonated yesterday by the member states like Brazil. Can you tell us why the international multipolar world order is better than the current one, especially for the rule-based order by some of the Western colleagues, and the most importantly, how you're going to persuade your Western colleagues to believe that? Thank you.
Well, on the deal, I will reiterate that it was not called the grain deal. It was called the Black Sea Initiative. And In the text itself of the agreement stated that this agreement applies to the expansion of opportunities to export grain and fertilizer. No, I don't suspect that Secretary General, I certainly can't expect him of having tried to have fooled us, of having been deceptive when he proposed a deal. I'm 100% certain that he acted sincerely. I know Antonio Guterres very well, and I can assert this with confidence. It's another matter that his honest and persistent efforts, which were geared towards persuading those who imposed sanctions to make an exception, at least for agricultural export of grain and fertilizer, these efforts unfortunately were unproductive, which I spoke about at length today already. Now turning to the question of how to persuade Western colleagues, how to convince them of the importance of forging a multipolar world order, I will not be persuading them. We have been setting out our position. The People's Republic of China, Brazil, many of others have been setting out their positions. And we have been proposing that we base ourselves on what is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, that we all have equal rights, and that we all need to strive to achieve a balance of interests and to collectively resolve global problems. And probably the best way to persuade Western countries of the fact that the multipolar world order is already taking shape is simply not to get in the way of a historic process. They are trying to intervene in this process by leveraging sanctions against the Russian Federation, naturally, which nobody had ever seen or could even imagine. But this is a matter that has been resolved for us. We have every opportunity not to depend on this kind of conduct, which is demonstrated of the Western colleagues who have demonstrated themselves not to be worthy of negotiating with or reaching agreement with. I've heard about semiconductors being prohibited, those sanctions being imposed on China. They're no longer allowed to sell them, and at the same time there are demands of South Korea that it not replace the replaced semiconductor provisions from Europe and the US with its own supplies. Though what their preparations are underway for a new round of a war for global dominance, or more accurately, a war to attempt to maintain global dominance. This can probably slow down the natural process of the establishment of a multipolar world order, but not for long. At the historic level, I don't think that will succeed. All of these claims and grievances, as Joseph Borrell mentioned, the heavenly garden, as he views the West, surrounded by jungles. Well, beyond this being racism and Nazism, this is a reflection of that very same philosophy, which is nefarious, malicious for all of humankind, including for the bearers themselves of this philosophy. President Macron, after a visit to Beijing, since we're talking about China, after the visit to Beijing, he said that Europe needs to be independent. He said that all allies, there is no need to follow the will of the U.S. in every issue. And he mentioned Taiwan, that it is not a European theme. Of course, parenthetically, it meant that the supposition was that Ukraine is a European issue, so it meant that Ukraine was waging war through the Ukrainians. But after Macron said this, Borrell, I believe it was just yesterday, advanced an initiative, the initiative for the European Union to send its military naval forces to the Taiwan Strait. What does this mean? This means that in Europe, either those who support Borrell's logic, either they have lost in any shred of independence that they had left, or they didn't reach an agreement there about what their united position would be. I have digressed from your question, but of course the multipolar world is objectively taking shape, and what the ultimate configuration will be, that's something I don't know at this point. Many, including yesterday during the meeting, mentioned that the G20 could become some kind of a template for a governance mechanism I think that it would be wiser to base ourselves on the United Nations Charter with the understanding that in order to reflect new trends, to reflect new realities, there will be a need to initiate Security Council reform. And possibly, ultimately, this could be something having to do with reflective of the composition of the G20 or something reminiscent of the G20. But definitely, there needs to be the eradication of the manifestation of the clear underrepresentation of African and Latin American countries.
Thank you, Maria. This is Mariam Ramadi, Afghanistan International. I have one question regarding Afghanistan. As you know, the Taliban recently have banned women from working at the UN offices. The Secretary General is traveling to Doha to meet with the special envoys regarding Afghanistan. What do you think the next step of the international community be regarding Afghanistan? And also one question about JCPOA. Do you think JCPOA is dead? Thank you.
On Afghanistan, yes, we supported the Secretary General's initiative to, on the 1st and 2nd of May, to convene a meeting in Doha of special representatives, including a large number of Western countries. All of last year and during this year, we have been addressing Afghanistan in such formats as neighbor countries. Just recently, there was a meeting held of foreign ministers of Afghanistan's neighbors in Uzbekistan. Last year, there was a meeting held in the People's Republic of China. And in parallel, there has been the quartet, Russia, China, Pakistan, and Iran. They have been working, and we invited India as well. We want this quintet to be constituted as something of a core for the format of neighboring states. We have maintained the Moscow format of consultations. Incidentally, the United States in the past had participated. Then they became capricious and they began to complain after the developments in Ukraine. They withdrew from the format. Then there was a Russia, there was the trio, which was joined by Pakistan. This format was also cast aside and dissolved. But somehow to bring the West into the process to facilitate settlement in Afghanistan, there is a conference being convened by the Secretary General, which we will participate in. Of course, we think that the West should not step away or walk away from discussions, because the West had a presence for 2 decades in Afghanistan, and it has done nothing to improve economic opportunities in Afghanistan. Narcotics production has skyrocketed there, and the pace remains at staggering high levels. The Taliban have tried to prohibit this, and we support this. But for Afghanistan's development, first and foremost, money is necessary, which the United States has seized. They have arrested the assets, and they refuse to release them for the needs of the population. And not only does the West need to restore those assets, Afghan assets, to the Afghan people when the conditions are ripe for this, but they also need to consider compensating for the damage wrought on Afghan statehood, Afghan economy, and the Afghan population by themselves. We believe that the Taliban are a reality on the ground, and there's a need to talk with them. At the same time, we will not recognize this de jure government until they comply with honor their own pledges, which at the international community have been recognized, specifically until they ensure inclusivity in the governing structures, not just inclusivity at the ethnic level, but also at the political level. Presently in the Taliban government, as they tell us, there are Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras. That's true. But all of these ethnic representatives are all Taliban at the political level. And for civilian society, of course, it is very important for there to be strong representation in political forces and for this to be provided. And there are other criteria for legal representation. Everybody talks about the key human rights requirements, including the rights of women and girls. Of course, this will be discussed during the conference which Antonio Guterres is convening. That's not a question for us. We believe that this is an agreement, and the resumption of this was an agreement was arrived at long ago. And right now, for some reason, European countries have lost enthusiasm. They're no longer enthusiastic, and Americans, through various sources, have already anonymously been stating that they need to try to find something else. I don't know. It seems to me that this is a huge mistake, to let the opportunity slip away. The opportunity to revive this deal should not be allowed to slip away, especially given that relations are normalizing among Arab countries, between Arab countries and Iran. Saudi Arabia, in particular, with support of the People's Republic of China, has restored relations. This is a process which is very healthy. And in principle, we believe that in the Gulf region, certain mechanisms for cooperation, transparency, confidence building should be established. However, at the present juncture, it's not up to Iran or us or People's Republic of China. The full revival of the deal does not depend on any of us. Those who destroyed it need to revive it. If there is any chance, then that would be in that form. Based on our assessments, that document, which was agreed upon last year, this document reflects that objective. Attempts to introduce new requirements which did not exist in the initial JCPOA text. These attempts, of course, complicate the process, and they reflect that same policy which we were already talking about today, to attempt through blackmail or to secure unilateral advantages.
Hamid Sayam from the Arabic Daily, Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Mr. Minister, you spoke about the golden billion.
About?
Golden billion, you spoke about it, and do you anticipate in the future to see that the world is not only one golden billion, but 8 golden billion? And the second is about the two-state solution. Everyone repeated this slogan, two-state solution. You know, I think, do you still believe there is any chance, real chance, to have an independent, contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state? Thank you.
Well, I think that we shouldn't give up. We are currently bearing witness to certain attempts to remove the political aspects of the Palestinian question and to focus on the proposals of certain economic benefits for the Palestinian people. Apparently, this is something of a bribe. Here you have financial means, but how about you forget about independence, about statehood? And I can't understand the logic here. Today, there was a mention made by the permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations, and in his emotionally charged statement, he defended the right of Israel to have a Jewish state. But if that's the case, then what about the Palestinians? Then they need their state. This is a recognition of the fact that the two-state solution is the only way to undermine the Jewish essence of Israel, which Israel is defending. So I do believe that common sense will prevail and cooler heads will prevail. And when an opportunity will emerge not to consider electoral considerations, then there will be a possibility to deal with this meaningfully. How can we not consider electoral situations when every 2 years one focuses on elections and re-elections? On the billion, I mentioned yesterday, of course, this is arrogant. It is impolite what is inscribed in the resolutions of NATO and the European Union. It's pure arrogance. These are all the people who say Black Lives Matter.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Maria. Greetings, Mr. Minister. Nice to see you again. Are you personally involved in any of the negotiations that would release prisoners in America and in Russia? For example, Evan Gershkovich. Are you personally involved? And I have another question, which is, it looks like the Ukraine admission into NATO is not very realistic, despite what some people have said. But as a member of the EU, it may be more feasible. What is your opinion on that?
На первый вопрос ответ простой.
As for the first question, the answer is simple, no. Regarding the second question, well, I can't make a decision on behalf of the EU, but we see how that organization is becoming militarized at a record rate and turning into an aggressive entity with the declared goal of containing the Russian Federation. If you look at how regularly the president of Serbia states his concerns about the demand to join in sanctions against Russia and recognize the independence of Kosovo, disregarding and ignoring the fate of the Serbs who live in the north part of that territory and have been living there for hundreds of years. This is what the EU looks like currently. If you're carrying out an anti-Russia policy, then you have excellent chances. But I'd be curious to see at the situation with Serbia, which I just mentioned, with Turkey, who for many years has been in negotiations. There are those in the EU who do want to to allow Ukraine to join on an expedited basis, and that will just show that it's nothing to do with meeting criteria. It's a geopolitical game, pure and simple, of tacking on as much territory as possible while it's up for grabs. Well, that's up for them to decide, but the fact that there is very little difference currently between the EU and NATO, well, I have no doubts regarding that fact, especially since the EU and NATO recently signed a declaration where they openly stated that we will be ensuring the security of your European Union, and the EU expressed recognition, and there was also a statement to the extent that this would all be important for our billion, and that's it.
Yeah.
Forgot to say who I am anyway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And I know I speak on behalf of all of us that when you're in New York, we always happy to have you here answering questions from us, Edith Lederer, from the Associated Press. As you look ahead to the rest of this year, what are your expectations for the state of peace and security in the world? Do you see prospects for negotiations or an end to the Ukraine conflict, to other conflicts, Yemen, Libya, you said Sudan. What are your hopes and expectations?
Ну, мне деньги платят.
Well, I'm not paid for hopes and expectations. We have to tackle concrete goals, and those currently pertain primarily to ensuring the security of our country and preventing Russians who for centuries have been living next door to us to be discriminated against and exterminated physical exterminated, as they publicly claim, by the Kiev regime, as the Kiev regime officially proclaims itself. As for the rest, well, politics are a special kind of beast. In 2003, some months after the beginning of the unlawful war in Iraq, George Bush Jr. Announced that democracy had won in Iraq in 2003. And what are your expectations from Iraq now? I have no idea. The same goes for Libya. When President Obama decided to lead from behind and put the Europeans up front, well, we saw another grave violation of a Security Council resolution which only called for establishing a no-flight zone to prevent Gaddafi's aviation from flying, and it was not flying, but then they went and bombed the whole country. It now lies in ruins. And what Obama said about Russia has now happened not to the economy of Russia, but to a country called Libya. And I hope that there will be progress on Yemen, since you mentioned Yemen. And today I noted in my statement that we value the efforts made by Saudi Arabia in this regard to establish direct dialogue. I won't even be guessing. With Ukraine, the issue is not that there's a certain timetable. Maybe in other countries there are timetables. I remember on Libya again, France repeatedly called conferences at which it was decided that elections would be held in 4 years and 3 months. And this was happening since 2015, and nothing has changed in that regard. So we need to simply, one must keep working on upholding one's lawful rights and doing this honestly, explaining one's motives, which is exactly what we did regarding our actions as part of the special military operation, and that we also wanted in a spirit of reciprocity to hear the same thing from our Western colleagues. What goals are they pursuing in Iraq, in Libya, and in other places where they are active in one way or another? But one must remain optimistic. This is all unavoidable, although they do say that a pessimist is a well-informed optimist. I think that's how the saying goes. But nonetheless, we will hope that the attempt to unify efforts will prevail, as well as the understanding that breaking up the global community into 1 billion and 7 billion is the wrong way to go. Placing one above others is also wrong, no matter what traditions of aristocracy, of lords and other high titles this might be justified by. We all live on the same planet, and we spoke just now about a Third World War. Who wants this? Well, it seems that some are prepared to go to the end if, once again, to quote statements made by some, if Ukraine wins against Russia, then we will avoid a Third World War. Well, that's a simple, tidy idea that currently is replacing a normal conversation between responsible political figures. I also wish you success in your work, your profession, which is very important indeed. And once again, appeal to you, given that there are fewer Russian journalists this time than there could have been, to help compensate for this lack in numbers by providing broad coverage of everything that you've heard for us today. Thank you very much.
Just a quick question about nuclear plant safety. Nuclear plant safety in Ukraine. Nuclear plant safety in Ukraine.